Good morning, folks, and a special welcome today to Dr. Ann Gilles, all the way from Canada. Ann, tell us who you are and what you're doing in life at the moment.
Well, I've been a trauma therapist, a psychotherapist for 25 years, and so specialized in complex trauma, treating adults usually who had been severely sexually abused, and a whole other, anything to do with abuse. That was kind of my focus. So now, though, I'm very involved in what has been happening in Canada with the banning of therapeutic choice. And so that goes back a little ways because I've been involved in research for those who have been same-sex attracted since my undergrad days. So it's kind of, I guess it's kind of where I probably should be, but it's not what I thought I'd be doing at this age and stage. So there you go.
So in just a minute, tell us how you got involved in this issue around therapeutic bans, because it's not every professional or therapist who wants to get involved in this.
That's exactly right. Well, someone had read from Edmonton, Alberta, had read my book, Closing the Floodgates, and she contacted me. I didn't even realize it was happening, but she contacted me and said, there is going to be a council meeting to vote on banning therapeutic choice. And in Alberta and Canada, it is called conversion therapy. And so she asked if I would please come to speak to the council. So I'm thinking, well, that's 3,000 kilometers. Do I want to go that far? But anyways, and for, 10 minutes. So I did do it, and thankfully. And so that kind of began this process. And I met a couple other pastors there, and we began to connect and to strategize a little bit. And then we knew it was coming to Calgary, Alberta, which is a much bigger city. And so there were a lot of people that got engaged. It was amazing, pretty exciting. And I'll talk a little bit about that going forward. So that's kind of how I got wrapped into this, and why am I speaking out? Well, there are a couple things. Certainly my personal past, but also my son. He was involved. He was part of the LGBTQ community for about 11 years, and yeah, and it's very interesting because he didn't tell us that he was going to leave. He actually was he decided at about 27 to go for some anger management counseling because he was really struggling with some issues. And he had a few years in anger management, another kind of therapeutic technique too. But at the end of about 3 years, and he said that's when he began to realize his identity didn't necessarily have to be in sex and sexuality, and it put a light on for him. And so he was already moving away from the culture, and what he realized is he was kind of still half in, half out. And he said, I can't kind of deal with what I want to deal with if I'm in the community. And so he left, and yeah, a lot of harassment upon leaving. Anyways, so my son's story, and it's very exciting, I think. So I'm kind of in for the long run.
We're clearly going to have to get to the bottom of that story because it sounds fascinating and very important, and clearly essential in terms of why you are involved in this, by the sound of it. But Ann, I'm going to ask you now, could you give us the facts and the details, the perspective that you have on Calgary's proposal to ban so-called conversion therapy? I'm going to bring in your presentation here.
Perfect. Yes, so what I thought I would do is that I would just actually read what the actual bylaw says, because there's something about reading out loud that really shocks you when you really get to look at this very clearly. So if you want to go to the first slide, then this is what they are calling, and they call it the conversion therapy bylaw. So it's called a prohibited business activity. And they describe conversion therapy, because these are the legal terms here in Canada, as it means a practice, treatment, or service designed to change, repress, or discourage a person's sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression, or to repress or reduce non-heterosexual attraction or sexual behavior. So it's very, very inclusive in the sense of people cannot even reduce their same-sex attraction. That's not allowed. We're not allowed to help them do that, even if it's their desire. And then they go on to say, for greater certainty, this definition does not include any practice, treatment, or service that relates to a person's social, medical, or legal transition. So that's the whole transitioning from a biological male to female, or vice versa. Or, here's the other thing, a person's non-judgmental exploration and acceptance of their identity or development. That's a little bit confusing, that one. So the next one goes along to say that this business means any commercial, merchandising, or industrial activity or undertaking, a profession, trade, occupation, calling, or employment, or an activity providing goods and services, whether or not for profit, and however organized or formed, including a cooperative or an association of persons. So I just added this a little bit. This will mean church associations, affiliations, and denominations actually will be held accountable. And there was no definition given for calling, but from a Christian perspective or a spiritual perspective, we believe in God calling us to certain endeavors. And so I believe that's what they're trying to move forward on. So in the prosecution for contravention of this bylaw, proof of one transaction or that the business has been advertised is sufficient to establish that a person is engaged in or operates the business, so the conversion therapy business. So as you can see, it's going deeper and deeper. The summary, then the next slide is the summary conviction offense. Any person who contravenes any provision of this bylaw by doing any act or thing which the person is prohibited from doing, or by failing to do any act or thing the person is required to do, is guilty of an offense pursuant to this bylaw. Gets a little complicated in the language, but you're getting a picture, I believe. The next step is incredible to think of. The owner of real property who is registered on title at the land's title office will be responsible for any act of a person carrying on business on the premises located on the property that constitutes an offense under the bylaw, in the same manner and to the same extent as though the act were done by the owner. So this is really interesting. So, and I kind of equate it to this: if someone went into an office building and shot a person, the owner of the building would not be held liable. And yet here in this bylaw, the owner of the property is actually going to be held liable. And what I believe there is that this is a real attack on churches, because if we can shut down the church, we can take their property, we can charge the whole administration, the whole association. That's all being in this bylaw. And then, so for the purposes of this bylaw, an act by an employee or agent of a person is deemed to be an act of the person. So if you have an employee that that suggests to someone that they could reduce their same-sex attraction if that's their desire, then not only will you be held accountable under this bylaw, but if you're working for someone else, then in the course of the employee's employment or agency relationship is also deemed to be an offense. So that means that I think that the whole of the church hierarchy is actually going to be held accountable. If a corporation commits an offense under this bylaw, here's the details. Every principal, director, manager, officer, or employee or agent of the corporation who authorized, assented to, acquiesced, or participated in the act that constitutes the offense is guilty of the offense, whether or not the corporation has been prosecuted for the offense. And then my last one in this section, if a partner is in a partnership is guilty of the offense, then each partner in the partnership who authorized, assented to, or acquiesced or participated in the act constitutes the offense and is guilty. And any person who is convicted of an offense, this is the bottom line, pursuant to the subsection, which is the identification of conversion therapy, is liable on summary conviction to a fine not exceeding $10,000, and in default of payment to a period of 1 year in jail. So this kind of all encompassing for sure when it comes to this bill. So the specified penalty of $10,000 is incredibly high for simply wanting to help someone. And why should we be penalized? And why is it criminalized? Well, that's part of another bigger story with our federal government. But the enforcement, where an officer believes that a person has contravened any provision in this bylaw, the officer may commence proceedings against the person by issuing a violation ticket in accordance with that bylaw. And this section will not prevent the officer from issuing a violation ticket, which requires a court appearance of the defendant, or laying an information in lieu of issuing the violation ticket. So, I mean, enforcement is going to be a little bit interesting, and I'm not sure how it will play out, but certainly the bylaw went into effect the day it was passed, which was Monday of this week. Now, I want to say some things that I think are really, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? So this bylaw will directly impact churches across Canada. Right now, it's just predominantly in the city of Calgary and in Edmonton. But the federal mandate is to get this pushed through nationally. So here's the kind of exciting news, though. There were 121 oral presentations. So each person who registered for an oral presentation via phone was given 5 minutes to speak. So it took council 2 days to listen to all these presentations. And there were over 1,800 written submissions. And I would say about half were from people who were opposed to therapeutic choice ban. Now, what I would say too here is that we had a deadline to get the presentations in, and it was the Wednesday before the council met, and the deadline, was there. So all of us from the group, and we have a group now called Free to Care. You can Google that. We had our presentations in before the deadline, and there was either just one or two from the LGBTQ community that had come in by that time. And due to pressure, they then opened it up for submissions to be made right up until the second day of the council meeting. So very interesting.
And
now,
just
yes,
ask you to repeat that. You said Free to Care, and we said
Free to Care .ca, I think is the, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that.
No problem. Carry on.
So, yes. Now, I wanted to bring some clarity because some of the council members in those meetings had specifically said that this would not apply to churches and to prayer. But at the end of the 2 days of meeting, Councillor Cara said this: the bylaw absolutely applies to churches, and it applies to pastoral counseling, especially anything on an ongoing basis. Also applies to speaking events, and so that would really apply to me, presumably, outside of actual preaching. So what I do usually are workshops and seminars on marriage or family and different things like that. But speaking events where same-sex behavior is called into question. So that means if I were to suggest that this was a sinful behavior, or that we're all sinners, but the behavior itself is not scripturally condoned, then I would be liable. And the ban on advertising in the bylaw would also apply to word of mouth. So that's a very interesting thing. I don't know how they would prove that, and they don't know how they would prove it. So there are a lot of things that will have to be ironed out. So activities to be punished, I think this is a really important thing to understand. It effectively means that if I was a same-sex attracted person and I found pastoral support helpful for staying in my heterosexual marriage, because same-sex attraction doesn't just happen within the LGBT community. And there are some same-sex attracted individuals who are married and want to stay married, but they have some thoughts or things that they seem to be more attracted, not maybe more, but at least equally attracted to the same sex. And if I wanted the support from my pastor to stay in my heterosexual marriage and told a friend about it, then I would be subject to this fine. So it's just a draconian, someone called it draconian, and it is a draconian bylaw. This counselor also said that donations to churches and institutions that support traditional understandings of sexuality could be punished. And we've had whispers in the past of funding for churches, so donations and charitable status being removed. And I think this is one more step in that direction. So, yeah, that's pretty interesting, things happening quickly. The council also made it clear, though, that anyone that openly spoke of marriage as being between a man and a woman, and that sex should be reserved for the institution of marriage, would also be subject to fines under this bylaw. So it is a bylaw aimed at shutting down heteronormative behavior, for sure, and shutting down a Judeo-Christian understanding of man and woman, and husband and wife, and family. So I do have another slide here of how it will affect your church. For instance, praying with a person and asking God to change or reduce their same-sex attraction will be considered to contravene this this bylaw. It's considered conversion therapy. Providing any kind of counsel that might have an impact on sexual orientation toward heterosexuality. So we really are being banned from providing counsel, which we knew that wasn't coming anyways. And then providing any kind of religious practice or program. So that would mean such as prayer ministries, weekend retreats, or discipleship programs that might change or reduce same-sex attraction. So these are programs that individuals want to go to. It's not they're being coerced into going to these things. So weekend programs, for instance, it's a group of individuals who have been in a 12-step program or some kind of similar program, a recovery program for any kind of sexual addiction, that these would all be classified as being conversion therapies and would be treated as criminal offenses. So anyone from any formerly gay ministry that provides help for those who are struggling with unwanted same-sex attraction, they will be charged, and they will either have to pay the fines or go to jail. So that's kind of where those things are going. Now, helping a person to embrace a Christian identity, and this is one of the things that we've been saying, that, and my son said this too, you know, he realized his identity wasn't just in his sexuality, it was so much more than that. And when he began to see how much more that he was as a person, rather than his sexuality or sexual behavior, it began to set him free. And so helping a person actually embrace a Christian identity will be considered conversion therapy. Helping a child who wants to become the opposite sex, to accept their gender, their sex, their biological sex, will be considered an offense, because we are only to affirm that child's thoughts and their ideas. So also helping youth who don't feel like they fit in with their peer group to become more confident in themselves and in their biological attributions, that will be considered the conversion therapy as well. So there's so many things here, because if we help an adult detransition, that's going to be under this bylaw, will be charged. Helping a person as they experience any changes in who they're attracted to. And so this happens within the LGBT community regularly, that, I mean, the whole issue of fluidity has become the total concept. And the bore in that way has gone by the wayside. I can talk about that more later, but there is a lot of fluidity. And so their experiences and who they choose to be as far as their behavior is very flexible. But if we help someone as they experience any of those changes, then we will be charged and likely convicted. Seminars that discuss sexual fluidity toward heterosexuality will be considered conversion therapy. They'll be a therapeutic choice ban. And so I can't talk about the fluidity toward heterosexual behavior. I can only speak on that fluidity when it goes toward a more bisexual or lesbian and gay identity. And then helping strengthen a marriage where one person experiences unwanted same-sex attraction. We have talked about that already. That is going to be considered an offense. So even resisting the temptation to engage in same-sex attraction. So talking about someone about their thoughts, even though they've never been involved sexually, is an offense. And having a discipleship support group, which I spoke of again, that actually helps people or expects or asks them to refrain from engaging in sex outside of a heterosexual marriage will be considered an offense. And having a Bible study that teaches any sex outside of marriage between a man and a woman is sinful will be an offense. So this will hurt Christian families and individuals. For children, there's so much confusion right now, and it's just going to get worse. This will hurt LGBT people because many of them have an interest in understanding biblical text, and they would like to know truth. They don't want what they've been told sometimes. You know, they want to know, what does the Bible really say about this? And it's going to definitely hurt the Christian church and ministries and other faiths as well. Certainly Muslim and Jewish people will be considered under this ban because all of these faiths, all of us believe in marriage, in biological male-female, and the efficacy of marriage and how good it is for family. So this is what's happening in Canada.
Well, thank you so much. That's a really good and detailed oversight of that bylaw. And what's the next step? I mean, presumably, if it goes through in Calgary, then it's on the books for the rest of Canada. What's the
yes. The strategy by the LGBTQ and a man named Dr. Christopher Wells, who is, I met him in Edmonton, and interesting, he actually developed or helped develop the gay straight alliance groups within schools in Canada. And he teaches gender study. He developed gender studies in the university in Alberta, in Calgary, and in MacEwan University. And so he's has a doctorate of education. And he basically, him and some other colleagues, put together this ban, the bylaw. And they are very, very much grouped together to make sure that this gets passed. Dr. Wells, as far as I understand, reports to our Prime Minister on issues of gender and sexuality. And so this whole thing is very, very much going to go from one city and one municipality across Canada. Right now, things are kind of held up, I think, a little bit federally, but that doesn't mean that it won't pass pretty quickly when it goes through the federal bill. And our Prime Minister has actually wanted it to pass quickly. So what that will mean, no one knows. Bill C-8, a federal bill, does talk of many of these things, but it never passed the first reading at that point in time, and then things have been shut down with COVID. So I think it will be ramped up pretty quickly. And in the meantime, the strategy is to go to different municipal councils throughout Canada, and certainly that's what's happening.
Now, it was really encouraging to hear about the submissions that opposed what was happening, and also the number of people who were frankly opposed to banning therapeutic choice. But it sounds as though it's a pretty dark picture. Is it too late, or can people do something about this, do you think?
Well, I kind of am a believer that it's never too late. And I think what happened in Calgary was a shock. Actually, the LGBTQ community was not prepared, obviously, because they had just a handful of submissions before the deadline. And of course, that all changed very quickly. So once they found out that at that point, we had over 300 pages of written submissions. So, and our submissions were well thought out. They were clinical. They were really, really well done. And so I think that really threw them for a loop, so to speak.
Now that's interesting. If you feel the LGBT in Calgary weren't particularly well prepared, or it seems that way, does this mean this is being driven politically? Now, I don't want to put you on the spot here in terms of political statements, but do you have a view that you would be able to share? Who is motivating this? Where is this coming from?
Well, when I say that they were unprepared, I think they were unprepared for those who would be against a therapeutic choice ban standing up. That's what they were unprepared for. They had prepared the council very, very well. And in fact, though, this is very interesting, the actual bylaw was not published until a week before the meeting. You see, there's political, yes. So there is a political strategy. Well, where that all comes from, I think that's a very long story. But I think it goes back. We have a whole issue with the sexualizing of our society. And there seems to be, certainly in Canada, these last 4 years, there has been an extreme push from our federal government to accept, and not only accept, but celebrate gay identity. We have instituted June as a month, Pride Month. There are no other such months for such things. Maybe other people, is there a Holocaust week? Not that I'm aware of, and is there an Indigenous week? Might be a day, but this is a whole month set aside to celebrating something that, a past Prime Minister in Canada, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, so that is our Prime Minister's father, he said that government has no place in the bedrooms of its citizens. Well, that seems to have certainly gone by the wayside, because this is all about the bedrooms of society, and what we want to see, not what I want to see, but what our government has really just kind of thrown out there with the pride parades is, are you kidding? What's happening in the bedrooms is happening on the streets. And it is repulsive. I'm sorry. I mean, I'm not going to win favor by that in many forms, but I find it absolutely horrific. It breaks my heart that people would take small children to watch this parade where there's nakedness, there's things that would have been prosecuted years ago, and so we have something's driving the political agenda. Let's just say that.
Now, I don't know what your view is in terms of the progressiveness of Canada, but from where I sit, it seems pretty progressive, and I thought I lived in a so-called progressive society. But do you have any perspective for those of us who may be slightly behind? Now, other European countries, of course, are going in the same direction. Germany, just with the last couple of weeks, have now implemented the ban, and we'll be covering that shortly. Albania has done the same thing. I didn't know there was a problem with therapeutic choice in Albania, but there you go. The Isle of Man, very close to UK shores here, a kind of protected state, has also banned conversion therapy, so-called. Never heard of any ministry or any attempt to do anything there. Malta, of course, was the first to ban in 2016. So slowly but surely, we seem to be clocking up nations who are going in this direction. But do you have a view in terms of what we can do?
Well, can I just say one more thing about that before I go to the view? One of the things that's driving this in all of these other nations, which you're right, it just seems, where is this happening, that people are being coerced and manipulated and tortured and all of that stuff? And actually,
where is this electroshock therapy? Have you come across it in your?
Never. I've never heard of it. Now, I should say that one of my friends actually had, and she's from South Africa. She experienced something like that. And this was many, many years ago in the hospital with a psychiatrist. And it was very devastating for her. This is like years and years, decades ago. But actually, what happened later is she ended up at a Christian ministry, and she experienced the love of Jesus. And she now runs a ministry for those who are struggling with unwanted same-sex attraction. So here's the dilemma, though, and one that I'm going to be doing, I think, some research on over this summer is the corruption of academia. And that goes back to Kinsey, and it comes so for 70 years, right? It's not like this stuff is just kind of been percolating for the last year. This has a history. Not so much what I'm talking about, banning therapeutic choice, but it was all leading up to this, right? To shut down anyone who might have a thought that maybe not all is well in the sexual realm. And so I think academic research has become extremely biased toward this particular issue. In no other type of research do I see such biases when I'm reading things on conversion therapy or same-sex change efforts. So we have all of that. So those things are really difficult because it's a very loud voice that is out there in the academic world, and that is actually providing the resources for politicians that are tearing apart the realities. So
that's the truth, isn't it? It's that viewpoint discrimination that does not require or allow viewpoints to challenge one another. You'd have thought that if the science is primary, if we're really after the facts, and if we're careful to strip away our own ideology, whether we, are so-called conservative or progressive, you'd think that we would need one another to sharpen ourselves and to clarify what the science actually says. But with such strong viewpoint discrimination, the people who control the universities, control the research money, control the publication, well, it's no surprise, is it, that in the end, it's only one viewpoint that is being promoted.
That's right. And so even though there's some really good research out there that identifies the efficacy of sexual orientation change efforts, it is just torn apart, and the researchers are pressured to remove those studies. The journals have removed the studies because of pressure. It's like so much abdication to this controlling body. I will just say that controlling body of academics and non-academics, I would say, but certainly there is a real pressure to conform to an ideology. And so for those countries and for those who haven't surrendered to this yet, I believe that somehow we have to get the accurate information to them. And I think if we become more proactive, before these bills are written by those who are advocating this ideology as being the best, and so here we went from equality, homosexual equality, to normalcy, homosexual normalcy, and then to homosexual superiority. And that's where we are right now. And so this is the agenda that's being pushed. And that's why it is no longer okay to talk about heterosexual marriage in a positive aspect. So we're behind the scenes because you know what? We've kind of just gone on with our lives and done what needed to be done. And we weren't advocating because I think as well as a Christian believer, I think we just thought, oh, well, this will go away. But I remember in 1988 when the United Church in Canada, they kind of split because that was when they began to ordain gay and lesbians. And that, I mean, that's quite a while ago now. And it's been this total trajectory from that point within the church. And now we have what is really confusing to politicians is we have gay Christians. I've never seen a thieving Christian. I mean, are there some out there? Of course. Do you know what? We kind of can be compelled to sin even after we're a believer, right? But we don't advertise it particularly. I'm an adulterous Christian, all of those things. And yet here is this element because for them, scripture isn't about change. It isn't about what I would maybe call the power of Christ to transform lives. And as Jesus said, go and sin no more. Those were Jesus' words. He wasn't condoning of sin. And so the church has lost its voice in many, many ways. And we somehow have to regain some of that back. And it's going to cost us a lot to do that, I believe. I think we're going to have to fight very hard.
Well, maybe it's almost an attempt to turn the clocks back and to revert back to the pre-Christian era when, the values of the Greco-Roman Empire, which were challenged by the gospel, particularly in the area of sexuality, once again reassert themselves. It's an amazing trajectory that we appear to be on. And I agree with you. I think it is fundamentally about the Judeo-Christian culture that has developed because of the gospel and because of the intervention of Jesus Christ, basically, in the world. And therefore, the hour is right, surely, for the church to recognize that this attack is really about the whole narrative of change, the very essence of the gospel, the essence or this idea of repentance, transformation, and change. It's not about perfection, but it's about people being free to live the lives that they want to live. And thank you so much for this. It's been invaluable to us. I'm going to bring this to a close now, but I'm going to invite you back and I'm going to ask if you would give us more perspective on your work on trauma and a little bit more about why you are passionate about this. But thank you so much. This is Dr. Ann Gilles from you are from Alberta, Calgary. Are you, Ann? Where are you from?
I'm from Ontario, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ann, and we look forward to seeing you again. This is Mike Davidson from IssuesTrust, and we look forward to meeting Ann again. Thank you very much, Ann.